Hello, Mridu. Welcome again, or the first time in our faculty and in Serbia and Belgrade. And I would like you, for us, to talk about our specific interest in filmmaking, and this is archive film practice. So my first interest is how did you get into archive, since it's always like some kind of incident or a very strange occasion when you entered this kind of digging into history, film history in general, but also history in general. So what is your start? What was your start?
I'm a creative producer. I make documentary films and also fiction films, but archival research has somehow become the backbone of my whole career. So when you ask this question, it's really the answer is about my first film. And my first job in filmmaking was with a filmmaker who was about to embark on a very long process of digging a story out of the history books and out of the archives. So I was hired to do research on a film about a man named Bayard Rustin. And he is a civil rights activist, and advisor to Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King. And he was 25 years his senior and practiced nonviolent protest in the United States. So he became a strategist and an advisor to King. And he was also an openly gay man and stayed in the shadows of the civil rights movement, never rising to the top of the leadership because of his sexual orientation. And so this was a challenge and an interest to me because I had done my master's thesis on Gandhi and his use of the body, his use of the body in civil rights protest in India. So there was like an intellectual connection to this story about America now. And we spent 4 years doing the research. I went to many archives, looking through footage of civil rights activists to find Bayard Rustin, because he wasn't in the metadata in these archives. He wasn't in NBC. But we did find him once we knew where he was when. So I knew he was, for example, at the March on Washington because he organized it. So we had to look through all the footage of the March on Washington to find him in the background, standing with Dr. King, standing at the podium, making his speech. So these are like different techniques that we did for that first film. And in that process, we found so much material that we could make a film about Bayard Rustin and place him in the center. So really the work was about looking at a historical figure on the margins of history and who had been left out of history and bringing that story into the mainstream. And our film aired on public television. It premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2003. And since that time, it screens almost every year. And now you won't see a film that doesn't mention about civil rights in America that doesn't mention Bayard Rustin. So that practice of research to impact is something that's propelled my whole career.
Yeah, it's interesting that the film was a first medium actually that you entered, and in a way the whole research was based on a film research. So you were looking for images.
Right.
I firstly entered the archive in general. It was basically film archive. I like film history in general, but more related to this, let's say, editing processes. For example, like Esvir Shub as a first female editor in Soviet, make these historical films of war historical films. It was interesting how you actually make these films based on editing processes. So you are completely make films from archive, and so my interest came from that. But then in the period of 2000s, like you mentioned, the beginning of 2000. Here, this culture was changing perspectives, and of course entering kind of this democratic transition in a way. Culture of erasing memories, especially from 90s, were so dominant, and my interest was to totally from below, like to start to collect VHS cassettes from people who were recording TV programs during the 80s and 90s, and this was a kind of pirate project with a couple of people, and then showing those VHS cassettes. It's something that in the States is called Found Footage Festival, but actually we didn't know. It started before YouTube and so on. So we collectively watched VHS cassettes from 80s and 90s in front of the public, and then we realized that historical notions are especially with those datas that are like happens every day. So you need one. You have one event, and then just past 1 or 2 years, there's just one representation of that event.
Right.
What was very popular in 80s and 90s, it was direct broadcast. We don't have like direct broadcast. We have live stream today, but television had direct broadcast. You could if you have access to material of raw material, you can really not to make different kind of event, but you can just make a different time of the event, and then you will get different knowledge. So even I also did some work that changes some perspectives of some historical events in the end of 80s, and then some datas in Wikipedia pages were changed, not by me, but someone else were watching that and change some names, bring some new names in that event, and so it's interesting how you can do that without. I guess that historians also watch films, and they also use films as a tool, but maybe less than we are filmmakers. So it's
I think the filmmaking practice is very powerful. The way you're talking about bringing footage from the margins into the mainstream, and in your work, it's like making that evidence. And same in my work, we're bringing that evidence, that visual evidence, to the public.
And how do you? What is your approach as a author and producer in general to these state archives and private archives, and even on that abandoned archives? Or how do you think that it's needed to make also how to produce new archives, or whether it's needed? I also have a problem with this archivist moment. It's a kind of who make an archive, and also it's a powerful position always. Every time we all learn that archiving is a very powerful position, and how it is built. And but what is your approach? Like, how do you work in generally for storytelling, personal storytelling? What is approach, for example, state archives and private archives? And do you have some specific strategies concerning, I don't know, copyrights and everything? Or
I'm really grateful to archives. I'm going to say that before I say how I try to upend what they're doing by providing access for the public to see their materials, right? But you know, as a filmmaker, you need the archives. And so when I say I'm grateful, I'm so happy that they're preserving our history. But I'm also a critical thinker, and I also try to think beyond what they have. So I think what I've done on most films is look first in the corporate archives because they have the material, and then to look beyond their metadata, to see, like I had talked about, looking at all the footage from the March on Washington in the 1960s, that, and then looking for our subject, Bayard Rustin, in that footage. So we're sort of expanding the use of the material they already have. But because he wasn't a famous figure, very well known. We're also looking at communities, so his personal narrative. He grew up in Pennsylvania. We looked at his high school. I knew that he was on the football team, and we contacted the high school, and the football manager, we could never have imagined this, that they recorded the football games because that's how they study strategy, but they did that with film in the 1910s. And so 6 months later, the coach called me and said, we have these film reels, and they're from the year he was a football player. Would you like to help us digitize them? So we were like, absolutely. It's a risk because we're paying money and we're filmmakers, we don't have a ton of money, but we took that risk, and it turned out that Bayard Rustin was playing football in that footage. So that's pretty invaluable for our film. We can tell that story. And then another example is he was a Quaker faith. His grandmother was a Quaker. So we looked at the Quaker community to see if they had archives. So these are not archives you normally think of, but it's really trying to brainstorm every single aspect of somebody's life and seeing if they kept any memories in their personal archives. So individuals, his nephew, his relatives, everything becomes an archive after you look at the corporate archives. And then also historical societies. Since he was from Pennsylvania, we found materials in the Pennsylvania Historical Society that helped us tell the story. And slowly, all these things add up to the story of a life that has been, you use the word forgotten, but I guess I would say erased by the more dominant narrative. And that also applies to your work too.
Yes, and it's always, I always felt like a little bit also scared when you enter some kind of life. It's always people that are not existing anymore. It's always a ghost story, and I like this ghostology also as a term. Like you entering into those private archives and private lives and all the details you find, and it's always like it's a research, and we all knew that modern novelists used to write novels. Doing this historical research and being precise.
And just how much time it takes. That's not, as a filmmaker, we just want the footage and we want to edit. Yeah. We want to start telling our story right away. But there's so much time that is required to do a project like a historical film or working with archival footage. And you can tell the difference. Just like you can tell in a verite or a contemporary story when a filmmaker has stayed with a story for 9 years versus 2 weeks. You can tell on screen in the finished film how much time has gone to the effort of finding that footage, and I think audiences respond to that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Did you ever were at let's say challenged to make a historical or archive footage on your own? To fake it. Oh. For the purpose of storytelling, in a way. For me, it was always a challenge. Like, there are a lot of lost films, but there are some datas about them. And should we make one? Just because they are lost.
I understand.
Especially if those films.
Because the importance lies in the value of showing the public what you have read about.
Yes.
You know it existed. You
yes, and nobody knows.
They
existed. Who read that? And of course, imagination is one thing, but it's not just important of that historical footage. It's important what that specific event of shooting that event. Or,
so in my work, I'm not against it.
No, yeah, but for me,
in my work,
an interesting question.
I haven't used recreations with actors so far, except that what we have done is bringing print materials to the visual form by using actors to voice the words that were written. So that we did in my last film that I produced about Jacques Cousteau, where we worked with a French actor, Vincent Cassel, to voice Jacques Cousteau's writings. Now, Jacques Cousteau is not an unknown figure, so we actually had a lot of material. But some of the materials we wanted were to express Cousteau as a writer and as a, to allow him to narrate his own story rather than having scholars narrate his story. So we used his writing and an actor to voice it, but not on screen and not recreating. So that's more of a esoteric use of it. Yes. It's not to recreate an action. Yeah. But in my current film, which I'm also directing, it's a documentary about two people who ran for Congress in the United States against each other in 1956. And they were both, one was a very exceptional woman, aviator and a World War II hero woman. And one was an Indian man who was a farmer and then became a judge and then ran for Congress. So two minority figures in American politics ran against each other. And I have 2,000 newspaper articles about this story, but I have much less audio and much less footage. So I'm faced with this challenge of what should I do? Should I use a recreation? Should I work with actors? And what I really want to do for this film is to use animation. So it would be 2D hand-drawn animation characters for the film, portraying Sand, the man, and Cochrane, the lady, and then using actors to voice the verbatim quotes from the newspapers. And by that means the exact quotes. So the exact quotes are the archival, but I don't want to just show you the newspaper. I want you to hear it and experience it as if it was footage.
Yeah, you want to make them vivid or...
Yeah, but using archival for me is a creative way of, you'll know it's not footage. Yeah. I'm not recreating it visually with actors in the traditional sense, but it will keep you in the story, in a direct relationship with the story.
Yeah, it's important. Who knows? And afterwards, someone will make a feature film anyway.
I hope so.
It always happens. And for the last question, I mean, just a notion. I mean, what do you think about it? How the future generation will talk about archives, today's archives? I mean, for me, it was always a question, and I get the questions from young people. Who collect images from 2000 and on. I mean, there are servers, but they disappear. There is a YouTube. There are a lot of different platforms, but they're not solid somehow. Nobody believes that it's...
well, I think as an individual, not as a filmmaker, we all have this struggle of like archiving our own materials. Like, do you edit your photos in the iPhone, or do you just must have thousands of them? So that's one problem, but then what will happen to it later? And when you compare that to a documentary about an author or a writer from 50 years ago, and you look at what we have to tell that story are actual letters that they wrote to their lover or to their boss, if it's the story, whatever the story requires. Those are actual physical materials, and with digital, it's much harder. We have much more material, but it's much harder to consider how to preserve it.
Yeah,
And emails.
Who knows? Maybe everybody in the future will write a book. Will have to write their own lives.
Maybe that's a good point.
And somehow it happens.
But that's if you're telling your own story.
Yeah.
What will happen if I wanted to tell your story 20 years from now? Yeah. First, I would have to gain access to all of your digital materials, if that's still there, right? So this is a really interesting question about what will happen to people who are significant today. Well, everyone's significant, but those significant.
Yeah, and the traces from social networks and.
Well, it's already started appearing in my films. On one film, it was called Who Streets, and it's about the killing of Mike Brown in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, in the United States, and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. We used social media, and that was the first time I had done that, where now we're pulling from social media, and then we have to deal with the rights of that. Who owns those texts on Twitter? Who owns Facebook messages, are we claiming fair use for these so that we can show reactions? So I think you'll see that more and more. Yeah. Filmmakers are using digital, like all of social media as archive material.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's, even this desktop cinema, what became like popular in this video art scene. I mean, everybody's using their interface as a kind of platform for editing. But my question is, as you are a prominent producer, do you really have to ask for those rights, or every big company in Silicon Valley, or what is your attitude generally? I mean, how do you approach? Okay, when you are in production team, probably you have to follow all the rules, but what would be your approach? For example, if it's a Twitter archive from like 10 years ago, should you ask someone first, and what is the...
I think it depends on how much you're focusing on that one person, because those the rights to the actual text or tweet or whatever is also tied to the right of publicity of the person. So are you exposing this person for their opinion, or are you using hundreds of them so that you can show the opinion of a society or of a group of people? And so I think your positioning and how you use it depends on how I would approach. But I approach all of these rights, even with corporate archives, going back to your first question, as a filmmaker and as an activist, because I really believe what we're doing is expanding the narrative, and that we have a right to do that. And according to the US law, we do have a right to free speech, even if that uses other people's copyrighted material. So almost all of my films, I've employed a dual strategy of licensing materials from the corporate archives. So I'm friends with the archivists and respect their preservation of materials and their ownership, as we all should. But I also want to speak out. And so there are almost on every film some items where we have claimed fair use, on some films more than others, because we know we wouldn't get the rights if we asked, because we're making a commentary on their work, or because, mainly because we're making a commentary on their work is when I've used it. Sometimes for social media, we just need to document how we're using it, and that we're not focusing on that one person. As an example, we're focusing on a community.
I think it will always be a problem with what is the public interest. And what do we? I mean, it is an activist process, since we are fighting for a history to change. I mean, we always use this sentence when you have like lecture performances. If we cannot change the images of the present. We can have to change images of the past. It's Chris Marker, but okay, I like to quote it.
Right.
And it would be always a fight.
It would be always a fight, but all to tell the story.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.